Enemy design is a quite explored topic within game dev communities, but a few searches about this topic and you find nothing but theories without any guide or practical way to doing things. In this video series, we will attempt to provide an in-depth look into the enemy behavior side of enemy design, and by the end of it, hopefully come out with a framework to aid us in figuring out what our enemies should do and how they should behave. Now this series will be split into a few parts as there's a lot to cover. As a heads up, this will mostly be focused on behaviors for enemies in a real-time action game, but you can probably also apply the same concepts to other genres. In this video, we will focus primarily on what I have determined to be the low-level aspect of designing enemy behaviors. By this I mean, how should my enemy be moving and what attacks should he be employing? For simplicity's sake, we will consider movement to have opposite sides. Moving away from the target probably the player, standing still, and moving towards the player. Some other nice movement types to consider are orbiting around the target and also moving towards a point near the target, but for now they will be ignored. For attacking, we will initially only deal with ranged enemies and later touch upon melee and other types of ranged attacks other than projectiles. For now, our enemies can only shoot projectiles, with the difference being projectile speed. Having defined our movement and attacking, we can now construct a few enemy examples. Enemy A shoots slow bullets and moves towards you. This fits into more of a grunt type enemy as he walks towards you and just shoots a few bullets. Enemy B shoots fast bullets and moves away from you. Here we get more of a challenge. The fast bullets are threatening, and the fact that it runs away from us makes it potentially harder to defeat it. Enemy C shoots medium speed bullets and stands still, tougher than enemy A and easier than enemy B. Now, having our example types, we can make a graph, with the x-axis being movement and the y-axis representing how our enemies attack. Here, we can see clearly how each enemy takes up a unique spot in our enemy graph. What this means for the player is that when confronted with these enemies, he has to employ usually a specific strategy for dealing with each one of them, due to the fact that the enemies have relatively unique movement and attacking behaviors. Now yes, all of them fire projectiles, but the projectile speed dictates how the player should react to each respective enemy. In other words, each enemy forces the player to rethink how he should play the enemy encounter. Moreover, since our enemies have a certain uniqueness to them, when we throw the different types together at the same time at the player, we get interesting results from the player's side, as he now has to think more about how to deal with the group of enemies that he's interacting with. The topic of spacing is important in almost any genre of games, especially in real-time action games where the position of objects of interest for the player, such as enemies, the player's avatar, interactables, etc., change constantly. I will not go in depth when analyzing the underlying reasons as to why spacing is so important, but I will articulate simple, surface level examples to show how spacing matters. Of course, to some this topic's relevance is self-apparent, but for clarity's sake we will quickly go over it. An enemy closer to the player's character is generally more dangerous than an enemy further away from the player's character. Additionally, an enemy with a gap closer, a skill/attack which allows them to get within a closer range to the player, is also more dangerous than an enemy without a gap closer. To further drive the point home, an enemy with an attack/skill that can threaten me from any distance is more of a priority to me than an enemy which has to get to a close distance to threaten me with an attack. Another point to consider is the enemy's position relative to mine, not on a distance basis, but on a directional basis. What if an enemy is behind me, and what if that enemy has a bonus or say a behavior which occurs once he hits his target from the back, like healing or dealing extra damage, for example? I think these are enough examples for now. Compared to the previous topic of spacing, for stats we will also quickly analyze some of them, such as health, movement speed, and also posture/poise, poise, whatever you may call it, but a stat which generally represents how easily an enemy can be staggered/interrupted, but also provides some practical takeaways that at least helped me a lot when figuring out the values for stats and what role they actually play for the player's experience. Health, as you know, is an important metric because it dictates how long the enemy, an object of interest to the player, is of interest. Once the enemy is defeated, I no longer have to think about or care about it. A key metric from this stat is time to kill, TTK. In general, I found for an action real-time game, a TTK for basic starter enemies of 3 seconds is okay. I decided on this from a purely arbitrary basis. From this starting point of a TTK of 3 seconds for starter enemies, we can then assign their health values. If, for example, my player deals 15 damage a second with his basic attack, I will give the enemy 45 HP to get a TTK of 3 seconds. With this, I now have a starting line for the TTK of my starter enemies, from which I can begin to consider the TTKs of, let's say, elites or bosses. In Code Blue's case, the TTK of elites is 32 seconds, and of bosses is 172. These values may seem very large, but the player's avatar has access to more skills than a basic attack, and can also purchase upgrades, etc., which reduce the TTK. Moreover, another point to consider about health and TTK is that a tanky starter enemy can have a TTK higher than the base of other starter enemies, but usually you would give him a drawback in another stat, such as, let's say, movement speed. This is done in order to maintain a similar combat score for each enemy within the enemy categories. We will touch upon combat score later. For movement speed, there's a lot to say, but for the purposes of this video, we won't go in detail. Suffice to say that 1. Movement speed ties in with spacing. A fast-moving enemy that moves towards me is more threatening than a slow-moving enemy that is also moving towards me. 2. An enemy's or character's movement speed can emphasize their role. For example, a self-exploding enemy, whose role is to deal damage to me, would benefit more from a higher movement speed than a slower movement speed. A big bulky enemy, whose role is to absorb damage for others, a tank, might benefit more from a slower movement speed in a scenario where he is blocking my line of sight from an enemy behind him. Enemy roles is another topic which will be covered in a different video. Posture represents how much posture damage must be inflicted on an enemy before he can become interrupted. This is how it's used in Code Blue. By interrupted, we mean if he is in the process of executing an attack or behavior, that behavior is stopped prematurely and is not executed. A quick mention of a key metric would aid us greatly in talking about the stat, time to stun/interrupt. TTS, basically how many seconds it takes to interrupt an enemy. Why is this posture stat important to enemy design? We will mention an example. Starter enemy A has a TTS of 1 second, so with one basic attack, assuming my player's basic attack speed is 1, we will interrupt him. This means that no matter his behavior, he will not get to execute it. Now suppose we have enemy B, who we have deemed that he needs to execute his behavior as it is crucial to his uniqueness or for whatever other reason. With a TTS larger than 1, let's say 3, he can now execute his behavior even if the player is attacking him. and finally, on the third player's basic attack, he will start getting interrupted. With this stat, we can fine-tune the chance that our enemy triggers his behavior. This can make an enemy more or less threatening, affect the enemy's uniqueness, and so on. An interesting point to consider is that a ranged enemy, who we want to at least execute his ranged attack once, and generally moves away from his target, can have a TTS of 1, because his effective TTS is larger than 1, since I, as a player, with a melee character, have to spend the extra time, let's say a second, to get to him, which gives him enough time to execute his attack, assuming the total time the attack gets is around 1 second. As we approach the end of this video, I'd like to briefly talk about the idea of a combat score, as this will help greatly in the final parts of this discussion. What I mean here by combat score is a metric which attempts to represent the player's effort required to defeat the target enemy. To come up with a value for a combat score, we combine the stats of an enemy with arbitrarily assigned weights. In my case, I have taken health as the preponderant stat, as it's the easiest stat by which you can assess an amount of how much effort a player has to put in defeating an enemy, as once he depletes all the HP of the enemy stops being of interest as it is defeated. A note here, it's up to you as a developer to decide what weight each stat has on the final combat score. We also assign a score to the skills an enemy has and perhaps its movement type. A fleeing enemy might on an average take longer to defeat, that is, more effort is expended by the player in defeating this enemy, as he has to chase it, than an enemy which charges towards the player. Having summed everything up, we get a value which gives us a sort of idea of how much effort the enemy takes to defeat. Now we can class enemy groups based on their combat score. Starter enemies could have a combat score of 6, for example, with varying stats. Starter enemy A has a high movement speed of 5, but a low HP of 15. And starter enemy B has a low movement speed of 1, but a high HP of 45. Yet, both enemies share the same combat score. This helps a lot with balancing and classifying enemies. An interesting point here is that if you have a procedural enemy spawner, you can dominate its decision making based on the combat score or a very similar metric that entities have, allowing for relatively easy tuning of the when and of the rate at which an enemy/entity spawned. Risk of Rain uses such a spawning method. Having curtly discussed some ideas around enemy design, we will wrap them up around the player's decision making. Since enemies are usually the way by which we challenge the player, then, at least to me, it makes sense that enemy design should be centered around the player's decision making and how he perceives the challenge of enemy encounters. Too much of a challenge being presented too often and the player gets tired. Too little and he gets bored. Keeping the player on his toes and then letting him relax is usually what is recommended by almost all the developers. But this specific topic will be covered in another video. What will be covered now though is the idea that enemies should have behaviors and/or stats which, in a way, force the player to rethink how he approaches things. A little idea to help us design this is taking the ideas of turns in turn-based games and applying them in real time. Say, arbitrarily, one turn in our real-time game takes 3 seconds of real time, with a time to kill of 3 seconds for grunts. It will take the player 1 turn to deal with a grunt-like enemy. Now, if I have a ranged grunt and a melee grunt, I can juggle them for some turns until it gets boring. Turn 1 and 2 is for dealing with melee grunts. Then we spice it up with 1 turn of dealing with a ranged grunt. Now, to not make the player bored, for the next turn we throw at him a melee grunt who has a twist. He can block, and because of this, his TTK is more than 3 seconds. Then, for the next turn we spawn a simple melee grunt for the player to relax his brain. Now, what if we throw melee and range grunts at the same time, and so on, so on. The combat score of the enemies we throw at the player helps us gauge how much of a challenge the player is being presented. We then control the variation of enemies to manage how often the player needs to alter his decision making, which is also a form of a challenge for the player. A great front to hit the player at is on his spacing/movement. For a line-shaped attack, the player moves sideways and avoids the danger. For a circle-shaped attack, the player moves directly out of the radius and avoids the danger. What happens if it is a hemisphere-shaped attack? We can also make the attack the player is currently dealing with be homing, i.e. a homing missile. The attack could also predict the player's movement, so now the player has to be more aware of how he's moving to dodge the attack. What if the enemy can now leap at the player? The list goes on. Now, to actually determine what the behaviors of your enemy will be and how they are varied is up to your game and the systems you have. A quick practical example that is used in Code Blue are projectile attacks. Some enemies shoot just a single bullet, some enemies shoot multiple bullets, some enemies shoot bullets one after the other, others shoot piercing bullets so you can't hide behind cover, others shoot bullets which twist the direction after a certain amount of time, and others shoot homing bullets which arc towards their target. In general, projectile-based attacks are easier to do than melee attacking systems, as you don't have any animations to manage other than a shoot animation. The rest is handled by the projectile itself. So okay, Mr. Video Guy, all this theory is nice, but how do I actually apply it to my game? What stats, what attacking behaviors and movement behaviors should they have? Now we will provide a simple framework to deal with these questions. So for the practical framework, step 1, identify the systems you either already have or are planning to build. Note, scope is important. For an action real-time game, you should probably have a movement system, a skill/attacking system, and a targeting system. For this example's sake, we will assume we have a movement system, a simple targeting system that makes our enemies always target the player, and for the skill/attacking system, it is assumed you have a projectile shooting system which allows you to quickly adjust the speed of the projectile to be spawned as a developer. Any extra thing, such as piercing projectiles, etc., would just add variation on top, which is scope dependent. With our systems in place, decide a TTK for your starter enemies relative to your player. Then decide a TTK for your player relative to your enemies. That is how many hits/seconds it takes for a starter enemy to take down your player. I chose 10 seconds for this TTK on a purely arbitrary basis. Afterwards, decide on what should be the base attack values for the player and for your starter enemies. And from that you can figure out the base health values for both based on the TTKs you chose. Make 3 starter enemies with the behaviors listed in the enemy examples section. I will quickly list them here as well. Enemy A shoots slow bullets and moves towards you. Enemy B shoots fast bullets and moves away from you. Enemy C shoots medium speed bullets and stands still. The projectile's damage should reflect the TTKs that you chose. For their movement speed, choose a value that you like. I tend to go for not too fast, but not at a snail's pace either, and also a bit slower than my player's avatar for starter enemies. If you have a posture system, go for a TTS of 1 second for the starter enemies relative to the player. The TTS of the player relative to starter enemies is completely up to you. Having set all this up, give it a test and play around with the values. A note here, it helps to have an Excel sheet set up with your enemy stats and skills, etc. to help with keeping track of stats. This is the end of this video. An inspiration for these ideas was a GDC talk by Matthias Warch in 2014. Link in the description. If you've liked or enjoyed the video, please consider either wishlisting or following or buying my game Cold Blow on Steam, link in the description. Due to my stupidity, there will obviously be mistakes in the concepts mentioned. So if you find any, please comment them. And also, if you have any idea that you believe is worth mentioning, please comment them as well. Have a good day. All the best.